Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode. Today we're here with Raritan Valley Community College Professor Anthony Celi. Thank you for joining us today. Can you please share a little bit about your journey into philosophy, what drew you to the field, and how has your work evolved over time?
Yeah, that's interesting. The long historical question. So I wasn't formally into philosophy until I was in college. I went to Montclair for my undergrad. And I found myself in an ethics class as part of the gen ed stuff over there. And I was kind of like, oh, I never knew this stuff I was interested in has a name. Like, I remember reading some Plato, so we looked at the Euthyphro. And there's this question in the Euthyphro. It's about, like, goodness and what counts as good. And the interlocutor of Socrates says something like, oh, well, I know what the good is. I know what the pious, what the holy is. Socrates says, okay, tell me, right? You're so smart. And he says, well, it's what the gods like. That's what makes something good. And Socrates responds with, well, is it good because the gods like it, or do the gods like it because it's good? And once I heard that line, I was like hooked, right? This question of like, is God higher than the good? Is good higher than God? So once I had that class, I was like, I gotta do this. Because I was always into weird stuff growing up informally, like skating and music and artsy weird things. So
That's really cool.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So I want to start off asking a little bit about Socrates. So in Plato's Apology, Socrates claims that he is wiser only because he knows what he knows. He knows that he knows nothing. So how does this paradox refine what philosophy means as a pursuit?
that's a good one. Yeah, Socrates was kind of a weird character because a lot of people love him and then people hated him, as you know, at the time, right? I mean, he was literally killed for doing the things that he did, which is what we're doing right now, right? Asking questions, doing philosophy. His whole thing was like, life is weird and complex, and the people who claim to know things as experts don't really know as much as they think they know. And he saw himself as kind of a gadfly, this idea that I would poke you until you kicked, until you responded. This idea that he had no knowledge or wisdom, but he hoped to give birth to that in other people by this like question and answer dialogue. So for him, philosophy, the love of wisdom, like literally, etymologically, was kind of about, you don't know as much as you think you know, let's start at the bottom and see where we can go from there. And that's wiser than thinking that you know everything.
Yeah, I mean, so kind of like we were talking about, the whole idea of the Socratic method depends on exposing contradictions through dialogue. What was he trying to achieve by questioning rather than just saying things and asserting things as they are? Like, why was he trying to nag people?
Why, right?
Yeah.
Like, because he liked it. So the ancient Greeks were really concerned with this thing called the good life. You see it written with a capital G. And actually, before he got killed in this dialogue, the Credo or the Credo, depending on how you pronounce it, we did this in class, he was on his deathbed and he was being offered all these ways of escape so that he can continue to live. And he told his friend, like, listen, I don't think life in itself is valuable. I think the good life is what's most valuable. So, like, if I have to die in order to preserve the goodness of my life, I'm going to do that, even if it means cutting my life short, rather than living a long, mediocre, or like decent life. So for him, this whole question and dialogue, this whole exposing contradictions was part of how we live the good life, right? This famous line he has, the unexamined life is not worth living, right? So he was just concerned with doing that.
That's really interesting.
Mm.
So I would like to move on to Plato, obviously his student. So in the Republic, Plato describes justice as each part doing its proper work within the soul and the city. How does that definition collect psychology and ethics?
I mean, what a lot of philosophers do is they try not to say things arbitrarily, right? Because one of the common misconceptions of philosophy is this idea that A, we think we know everything, and B, we're going around just like saying baseless things based on feelings or whatever. And so every philosopher is going to try and make an argument that is objective and rational. It's supposed to like withstand these kind of straw man criticisms we get. And that often means basing your ethics or your politics or aesthetics or whatever in something natural or in something real. so in the case of someone like Plato or Aristotle, it's like, hey, what is human nature like? What is nature? What are the rules of it? What is human nature? How does it fit into that? What is the structure of the soul? Or like, how does the mind work? How do we obtain knowledge? And it's because once they have that, then they're like, all right, we're going to base our ethics on how humans are to figure out how humans should be, how the ideal city should be. So I guess the short answer to your question is, well, we look at how humans are, because if we don't know human nature, it'd be kind of baseless to try to make a system of how they should be.
Mm-hmm.
It's like being the ruler of a subtype of things that you know nothing about. Like, that'd be kind of crazy, right? So it's like, let's get to know humans so then we can figure out how humans should be.
How does that fit into his idea of Platonic forms?
So the forms is weird because, on the one hand, it's one of the first things you talk about in philosophy, and so you might get the idea that it's really easy or something, but then it's also hotly debated and written about, like in high-level scholarship in grad school and stuff. But the general idea, I think, is kind of built into the philosophy itself, which is this idea that, okay, like, here is a thing of a protein shake, this is a bottle of tea, this is a wallet, this is keys. So these are all particular things. And Plato had this idea that all particular, concrete, tangible things in our sensible realm are kind of imitations. They participate in some larger form of what it means to be that thing on the universal level, right? Its essence. So the idea is, like, you have all these chairs in these rooms. They're all different particular chairs. They're different particulars because they're different, like, spatio-temporal objects in the material realm, but they all share something. And that thing they have in common is the form of chair or chairness, what it means to be a chair. And so how he uses this framework in the context of something like the Republic is like, well, we want the ideal city to be the J word, right? Just. So if you're trying to figure out what justice is, you have to engage in those same methods where, like, you look at all the examples of justice. You see what they have in common. You try to get at different definitions of justice, and you test them, right? To see, like, does this apply to all instances? Is my definition too broad? Is my definition too narrow? And so the idea is that when you have the knowledge of these forms, only then do you have, like, wisdom. That's kind of what philosophy seeks. We don't care about little contingencies so much. We care about underlying patterns. And so it's those patterns that help us live the good life and try to, I guess, structure things, if that makes sense. I mean, it's like science, right?
Yeah.
You guys are trying to figure out the laws of nature. That's exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, and do you think that isolates the philosopher from society, like understanding things true forms, like that, the whole idea of the allegory of the cave?
Yeah.
That gaining wisdom is transformative and sometimes painful.
Yes, that's definitely true. We're seen as weird, right?
Yeah.
I mean, among scientists even, are like, oh, these guys. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson had this line once about, like, philosophy is just sitting around contemplating about whether you can clap with one hand. Something kind of crazy like that. And it's very unfortunate. So yes, it separates us from people. And Plato knew that, because in order to engage in this, this way of thinking that has you looking at underlying patterns of the fundamentals rather than just, like, on the level of particulars, which is more practical, most people don't function like that, right? Most people are practical. Most people just want to do stuff. And so when you start challenging or being like, wait, what if I told you the things you thought maybe were wrong? It's kind of this matrix-like situation that someone like Descartes got into, 1,000+ years later. And I mean, you brought up the allegory of the cave. It's a perfect example. He thought education should be painful. It's weird, right? Like, because it challenges everything you know, and it's analogous to looking at the light, like when you go outside on a sunny day, right? You're like, oh, this sucks. And then you have the initial urge to turn back around and go inside because your eyes hurt. And for him, that's like akin to asking these questions and trying to gain knowledge of the forms. And so for him, he's like, please don't turn around. Stay outside, like, go deeper into the sun, because that's really how you live the good life. But just be aware that when you do that, you're going to want to turn other people onto this thing. and they're going to hate you. They're going to think you're weird, and in some instances,
They're going to get killed.
They're going to kill you, right? Because this is literally what happened to Socrates.
Yeah. So how did this idea play into what they understood to be the ideal form of government? That there was these people who had this knowledge of what true nature is.
Oh yeah, the philosopher kings.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm getting at.
So yeah, the Republic is weird. Plato in general is weird because he doesn't really ever give concrete answers. So philosophers talk about how Platonic dialogues end in this thing we call aporia or aporia, this idea that there's no way out. It's a state of perplexity. And there's a bunch of theories on why that's the case. I think the most common theory is because, well, even if we don't know what is true, the dialogue helps us move away from what's false, and then we get closer to these things.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, Socrates as a character, he never says this is what it is, for the most part, because he's not trying to say he knows anything, but kind of a little bit that happens in the Republic. And Plato kind of criticizes all these different forms of government, whether it is oligarchy or democracy even. He thinks that the ideal form of government is this thing called philosopher kings, which hotly contested thing, right? It's kind of a buzzword. It kind of sounds weird. Maybe it is weird in a not good way. But I guess one common misconception about that, and this will to answer your question, is that he had in mind some kind of very powerful dictator or something like that. Because in the Republic, they actually talk about these people shouldn't have money, or these people shouldn't have influence, like a rich corporation dictator or something like that. It's more like they think realistically, the people best equipped to make decisions about X are the people that are experts in the field of X. So when you have a cough, when you feel sick, you go to a doctor, right? You don't go to a construction worker. When you need something fixed in your house, you call a plumber. You don't call a poet, or something like that. And so they were just trying to flesh out that idea when it comes to justice. They're like, hey, politicians and speechwriters, the sophists, these aren't professional justicers. These are just people who pretend for the sake of power and whatever. So really, the should-be experts on this field are philosophers, right? Ethicists and political philosophers. So it's like, if we're trying to have a city that functions well and is conducive to the good life, we have to have the people who know what justice is. Because if we don't, then you just have a crazy person ruling the city, basically.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting.
Yeah. On the one hand, it sounds crazy. On the other hand,
yeah, because it kind of takes away some degree of, I don't know, autonomousness from people who aren't philosophers to make decisions about how they want to be ruled.
Yeah. Do you know why he thought that?
Why he thought that philosophers should only rule, or?
Yeah, why it was dangerous for everyone.
Mob rule.
Exactly.
That's why he got killed. But
yeah. So he was a critic of democracy for that very reason, because he thinks there's something noble in democracy because it's supposed to decentralize power. That's the whole point, right? It's we're moving away from this idea of a corrupt oligarchy or something like that, and so it falls to the people to dictate their own life. And for him, he thinks that can become corrupt because it pits people against one another, the whole majority-minority thing. It results in demagogues being able to persuade people and create factions and you can't say that now a little bit, right? And so his idea is that will collapse and then just fall into the worst kind of dictatorship because it leaves us really vulnerable. So in the same way, if I'm trying to be a devil's advocate for Plato, I think he would say in the same way that you don't crowdsource specialized knowledge of other things, you shouldn't crowdsource specialized knowledge when it comes to justice. It's not to say it's right or wrong, it's just that's kind of the idea.
I guess politics just seems to me a little bit different of a domain than a specialized field like nursing or being a doctor, because it involves everyone there and it determines how they're ruled. So I don't know.
Yeah, ironically, some philosophers critique democracy on the basis that it's not really self-determination. It partially is. So in other words, it's not just you deciding about your own life, but it's you making decisions about how other people should live. And so there's a lot of criticism on that. But you're absolutely right. If this gets into the wrong hands, we're screwed, right? And even in principle, it's flawed. Maybe we should allow for these kind of mistakes. That's fair.
Yeah. Well, I think we should move on to Aristotle next. Talk a little bit about what he thought.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, so in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that every art and inquiry aims at some good. What distinguishes the human good from other kinds of good in nature?
Yeah, okay, so Aristotle's actually a really good example of that naturalistic good life thing, because he's looking for these patterns in nature. He says, all right, everything works towards some end. He calls this teleological, right? This view that everything has a built-in function, I guess you can say. The tomato seed doesn't choose to become a tomato. That's just like built into what it means to be a tomato seed. And he thinks humans are no different. And the human built-in function is this thing called eudaimonia, which gets translated in many ways. I think the most common translation you see is happiness. I don't know if you came across this when you were in class researching. But it's a lot more than that, because happiness is really broad and fleeting. Some people call it the good life. Some people say it's flourishing. But if you break the word up etymologically, it kind of means like you're in this way of being that is really good, and so much so that it like elevates you to almost a godlike level, or that your spirit is fundamentally good in some way. And for him, this is having this really holistic, great moral and intellectual character, which he says is being virtuous.
And did he believe that was actually an achievable state, or just something to strive for?
That's a good question. It is a kind of ideal theory in the sense that it sets up like moral exemplars. And you can think of an exemplar as like a role model. So it's like, how should I behave? Well, you should behave the way a virtuous person should behave. How should I think? You should think the way a virtuous person should think. And I think it's somewhere in between. I don't think it's just ideal theory, because we are able to make real distinctions between people who are more and less virtuous. And also because he was a very practical philosopher. He thought philosophy shouldn't just be a theoretical thing, it should bring in the everyday. So I would say, yes, you can be virtuous on a scale.
I remember asking you in class if he thought he was virtuous.
Oh, gosh. I think he tried. Yeah, I think he was like thinking about the good life and how to live it is already better than someone who doesn't do that. Trying to figure out the structures of nature in a way that's beneficial is better than not. So I think he would be like, I'm not a bad guy. I'm trying to be virtuous.
So I guess you kind of already answered our next question, but Aristotle defines eudaimonia as activity of soul in accordance with virtue. I wanted to ask you, how do you think that this idea is different from the pursuit of pleasure or emotion-based happiness that we think of?
Yeah, that's good. So I have in front of me a cup of Earl Grey tea, which is my usual morning tea. I drink my Earl Grey tea, and I go, I could start the day. It's like how some people are with coffee, right? It feels good. I have pleasure. I'm happy in some sense. But like that is not the ultimate end of my life nor any human's life, right? It has to be something more grandiose than that. So pleasure, it's fleeting. You feel pleasure and then you don't. Happiness, you're happy and then you don't. And Aristotle's idea is like, well, maybe that's okay, that sometimes you don't feel pleasure or happiness all the time if there's something bigger that you are trying to achieve or becoming, like meaning or eudaimonia. And so eudaimonia, in some sense, is like living moderately. Mm-hmm. Well, living moderately is how you achieve eudaimonia, whether it comes to whether or not you fear things, whether or not you're honest with things, how much wit and enjoyment you get about things, whether you're temperate or just engaging in pleasures all the time. He was all about that. And those things are much more calculated. They're much more rational, which is why he thinks this is only something that belongs to human nature and not animal nature, because animals don't have intellect in the way that he's talking about. Their soul is characterized by perception and emotion, and plants' souls characterized by pure nutrition, whereas humans have this extra thing that allows them to engage with themselves in the world in this more like, whoa, crazy way. And so eudaimonia is much bigger, much more meaningful, much more dimensional than this idea of pleasure or happiness.
So I guess this directly contrasts to like Mill's pleasure principle.
Oh, that's a good one. You studied. This is good. So Aristotle's beef with pleasure, something I should have mentioned, is also because nothing is good in excess. So something like pleasure, he would say, it's good, but it can't be your ultimate end, because to say that something's your ultimate end is to be like a maximal amount of that thing is good, and he doesn't think that's the case. He doesn't think a maximal amount of anything is good except virtue, right? Because virtue is, by definition, moderate. But how that contrasts to someone like Mill, at least on the surface, you're right. Because Mill is all about the pleasure principle.
And one of the misconceptions was that that's a very animalistic way of thinking, which
Yes.
you just said was like what makes a human different from like a plant.
Yeah. I mean,
These short-term pleasures.
that's true. And so when Mill's writing utilitarianism, he's kind of responding to critics of this Greek philosopher Epicurus, because Epicurus was a hedonist. I mean, we've all heard this word, and in contemporary culture, hedonism has like this very negative connotation, right? Like, oh, you have a gambling addiction or a sex addiction or your drug addiction, like this person's a hedonist, right? All they care about is just like doing crazy stuff and pleasing themselves. And Mill tried to save hedonism from that. He thought that if people were opposed to Epicurus because they thought of pleasure as intrinsically animalistic, then they had the wrong idea about pleasure, and that it was actually them and not Epicurus who had a lowly view of humans, because actually humans are capable of much higher pleasures, and these are the intellectual pleasures.
And he says, doesn't he say something about like a smart human or an educated human will prefer the higher pleasures over these lower pleasures?
Yeah, he says someone who experiences both types, like no one's going to be like, oh yeah, the lower one's better. You experience both, you go, the lower is good, but yeah, clearly the higher is more valuable, in the same way that no one's going to choose like a $5 bill over a $100 bill.
Yes, but also so I remember in class, we used the example of like reading a book versus sitting on the couch and eating chips.
Yeah.
So reading a book would be a higher pleasure and eating chips would be a lower pleasure.
Yes.
So going back to Socrates, Plato, and you just explained how he said when you look at the light, sometimes you want to look away. And I think a lot of people would argue that they prefer to eat chips than read a book, at least
100%.
at first. And then you become like, and then the more you read books, maybe the more you like it.
Yeah.
And the more you try to get people. So, like, how would you...
Like, how do I think Mill would respond to that?
Yeah.
I think you'd say you're right. Like, which is why I think
But, like,
he chooses
almost
the word acquainted with. Right? So if you're like if you're someone who's like, my life is eating chips on the couch, I don't do anything else. It's like the prisoner in the cave, right? Where you can only see the shadows, so to speak. And when someone's like, here, like, read a book, or, I don't know,
But they might
engage
not
in
at
art.
first.
Yeah, they're going to be like, this sucks. I'd rather just eat chips, absolutely. And I think Mill would say that's because they're not acquainted with both. And that's bad.
So what do you mean exactly by acquainted in this?
He says something in utilitarianism like those who are familiar with both. So it seems like to be someone who has experienced both for what they are. So if you experience a book like the way a little kid experiences a vegetable, it's like, you're not really familiar with it. You have this outsider perspective, right? So I think what Mill had in mind was if you actually like start to try it and learn what it's about and do it for what it is, then you're like, oh yeah, I get this thing. Because otherwise, he says what you're doing, he doesn't make a value judgment. He says what you're doing is you're making yourself more animalistic. He says if you don't use reason, all you have is, and this is from his book on liberty, the ape-like quality of imitation. So much like Aristotle, he is drawing this hard distinction between animals in the colloquial sense, because we're animals, right? But the lower animals and humans, and that distinction does have to do with intellect. So although there absolutely is some kind of difference, one being Mill is action-based, Aristotle's character-based, his ethics, there is a lot of overlap in that they do value higher level meaning for humans. But you're right, utilitarianism is not virtue ethics.
I know you touched a little bit about moderation. So the doctrine of the mean is often misunderstood as moderation. How does Aristotle's notion of balance depend on reason rather than mere restraint?
Yeah. Mean moderation, intermediate, all those words are kind of similar sounding. But I think Aristotle, what he does in the Nicomachean Ethics, he's careful to be like, well, I'm not saying that in order to be virtuous, you see like what's the most extreme thing in this situation and what's the least extreme thing in this situation, and then like always be like, what's the 50% mark? A, because there's not always a 50% mark, and B, because sometimes he thinks it's actually better to be a little bit closer to this excess, and then other times it's a little bit better to be closer to this other excess, depending on the situation and depending on what your default disposition is as a human. So on average, you're somewhere in between extremes. You're not excessive, you're not deficient, you're doing the right thing at the right time depending on the information and, you know, who you are at that moment.
Did he believe it was possible to actually like reason and logically deduce what the right decision was? Like at the, because when you say like at some points you have to be more moderate, at some points less moderate, to me that sounds like a lot of wiggle room, and which can obviously lead to not moral decisions.
Yeah. No, he doesn't think you can deduce it perfectly. Like Kant would say that, right? That's like totally an Enlightenment way of thinking. This is why he's concerned with this thing that's called phronesis, which later gets picked up in Latin as prudentia, in English as prudence or practical wisdom. And this is just kind of something you learn as you go, right? He says like, you do teach virtue, but you also don't really learn to be virtuous until you practice it. In the same way that like you don't become a good doctor until you practice medicine. You don't become a good basketball player or guitar player or singer or dancer until you practice these things. So he thinks that virtue is this lifelong pursuit, and the more you do it, the more you gain this practical wisdom, and the better you get at it. So you're right, there is wiggle room. There's a little bit of gray area. It's not totally relative because that would be chaotic, but there is more wiggle room than someone, say, Kant, and he's okay with that because he thinks it's this learning curve, I guess.
That's interesting. Do you want to go into Stoicism?
Sure, but one quickly I just wanted to ask, did he think that people had an innate understanding of virtue at all? Like,
No.
They were just completely animals, they're just born animals?
He doesn't think you're born animals because the innate capacities of animals are different than the innate capacities of humans, one of them being reason, right? Like animals don't have that in them. So what he says in Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics is that everyone is born with the capacity for being virtuous. And it's up to their teachers and their community and themselves whether or not that virtue like actualizes as such. So no one's born good, no one's born evil. We're all born with the capacity. That said, maybe our natural capacity is a little bit more towards the not virtuous, because if it wasn't, we wouldn't have to be trained or learn. So yeah, I mean, don't go around pleasure seeking in excess, even though that's our natural tendency. But yeah, you have to try. Yeah,
so I guess we can go into Stoicism.
I know this is your favorite.
Yeah,
too.
no, I love Stoicism. The whole idea that
he's the one that taught me. He knows a lot about it.
Yeah, I read Meditations a few years ago, and it resonated with me a lot. This idea that you can't let external factors control your internal mood. So how does that play into like the moral agency of the individual? So,
thinking.
Yeah,
just in general, like the concept of agency.
Yeah, because I mean, Marcus Aurelius basically says that accepting fate as nature's will. How do they reconcile that belief with moral agency and free will of the individual?
I don't know if they can, like logically, because you're right. Because on the one hand, Stoicism does have this deterministic bent.
Yeah,
it's like nature is outside of your control, and it's going to happen 100% of the time, no matter what you do. So, in some sense, you don't have agency, but on the other hand, they think, at least to some extent, depending on how you interpret it, that your internal state is totally controllable. So, right, we can't control tornadoes or the sun blowing up or anything like that, or I'm about to sneeze. Okay, we're good. Or my sneeze right there, that was actually a good example. Or if other people treat you poorly, or if you don't get a job or something, but you can control how you think about it. So if we're trying to reconcile this for some general view of moral agency, I think they would say you are free and responsible for your own way of thinking, interpreting, valuing, believing, and that is like real agency. Anything outside of that, you don't have agency. But this poses a problem because like morality is not just thinking, right? It does involve behavior for most people. Certainly someone like Aristotle, where it's not just the thought, it's the actions in the world. I guess they would say, yeah, you don't have external moral agency, which includes even your body, right? Because you can get sick and die and like lose feeling in your arm. So the only moral agency you have is the internal stuff.
And do you think modern science would, he would change his opinion about that? Like the understanding that there's now chemicals in our brain. And
that's like very what if, but...
No, I think it's a good question. I think we should ask that question. I think a lot of... Here's what I'll say. It's possible. It's also not possible because they think maybe the scientists are getting something wrong or they're working with some false premises or something. It's also possible that they would reject that criticism in principle because they think there's something intrinsically flawed with maybe the scientific worldview and method. Philosophers and scientists have this weird, contentious competition.
That's interesting because I see a lot of overlap between science and philosophy in terms of the scientific and empirical method of coming to a conclusion. And this idea that you can never prove something right, but you can only prove that other things are wrong.
That's why you like philosophy so much.
Yeah, you're one of the good ones. No, it's weird, because historically we did used to be the same. Yeah. And Aristotle did science and zoology and like all these things.
Yeah. I mean, haven't you read a lot of like the like mathematics thing?
Yeah, like the philosophy of fit. Like we talked about it even with our previous guest, who's also an engineer, how philosophy and physics were very intertwined at first. Almost every philosopher, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they all dived into Pythagoras, they all dived into mathematics and physics because they viewed it as an extension of philosophy.
Okay, I'm thinking I know who you interviewed last. We'll talk about that after.
Yeah.
I mean, we share a history, and in some sense we share the same goal. It's just that at some point in history, we recognize a couple things. Thing number one, we actually weren't interested in the same goal, because if you think about like science as a method, it brings with it a lot of very specific positions in like ontology and epistemology, right? Like science is very much like we're going to use these, as you said, empirical methods, which means you see sensory observation or perception and machines that allow us to do that. This is how knowledge is formed. Whereas a philosopher is going to be like, maybe, but I think there's other ways of coming to knowledge other than empiricism. There are other philosophers that outright reject empiricism. I mean, the scientific worldview kind of adopts the very specific view about the external world and it's being made of matter. And the idea that the mind is ultimately just your brain and is reducible to this physical stuff. And there are some philosophers who are like, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe there's like an immaterial substance. Maybe there's multiple substances. Maybe there is no external world, right? So I think what happened at some point in history is the scientists kind of narrowed their scope. They were like, all right, we're going to go for this goal because it has very practical results. It helps us predict the future. It's very useful in like engineering and in medicine and all these different things. And the philosopher was like, all right, cool, you go do that. We're going to keep like being broader in scope while acknowledging that science is useful. But we're going to kind of like not limit ourselves to that. I think that's the original split. The later split is there's a lot of like name calling, and I think you guys rejected us, but that's another conversation.
Well, when did this happen?
I mean, think like scientific revolution and enlightenment period, right? So think like post-medieval era, where the things we think we know about the world are changing, right? It's throwing everyone into a loop, which led to Descartes' meditations of like starting over. It's somewhere in that period, and at some point, like Newton, for example, Newton was considered a philosopher.
And so is Descartes, who was also a mathematician. We use Cartesian notation all the time.
Right.
So there's still like some overlap.
And Leibniz, right? Who is also cited now in like math and physics as being like the creator of calculus, right? These people were philosophers. But what happened now, it's like we okay, and I'll stop this. But like at some point in history, what happened is the scientists were like, oh, all those good philosophers, they're scientists. And all the people who weren't good philosophers, those are just philosophers. But that's another conversation. But I agree, it should be a big tent, and I wish we talked more, because I think we could do a lot more good doing that than just like bickering at each other. Yeah, no, you're right.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think we should move on to ethical relativism now.
Okay, my favorite.
Hot topic.
Oh, God.
So, ethical relativism argues that moral truths vary by culture or context. What classical philosophers most strongly oppose this idea?
All of them. It's not literally all of them, but really philosophers hate relativism largely because it goes against the premise of philosophy.
Right.
Right? The premise of philosophy is we are trying to pursue truth. But if there is no truth, we can't pursue anything, like whether it comes to metaphysics or epistemology or like ethics or politics or aesthetics or anything. So they reject it. There was this pre-Socratic philosopher who was famous for this line, man is the measure of all things. This is Protagoras, I believe. Meaning, everything is in us. Everything is like a construction. We kind of like make divisions where there are no divisions. We make unity where there is no unity. And so there's this idea that everything is just us and there's no real thing out there. That, of course, is just a fragment. We don't know 100% what this person thought. Yeah, I mean, most philosophers reject this because then what they would be doing, everyone could just say, well, it's relative, and then we'd have to stop the conversation.
I mean, this is an idea I've been struggling with, though, because, like you said, most philosophers would argue that ethics aren't relative, but many of them have different philosophies. So how do you reconcile that?
Oh,
with
good.
Very different philosophies, too.
Super good question. Yeah, so the thing that saves it from being relativistic is like, the relativist goes, well, see, you have all these different beliefs and ways of approaching this topic, therefore, there's no right answer. And the philosopher goes, no. There's all these different ways of approaching it, but some of them are wrong, and some of them are right. So, like, what most philosophers will say is that the plurality of beliefs and systems is not in and of itself proof that there is no correct answer. It's just proof that we're all trying to get the correct answer. We believe it's out there. Maybe some of us are closer than others, whereas the relativist is going to be like, yeah, no, it's just, that's it. Yeah. Does that kind of make sense?
No, I mean, it makes sense.
Think of it like, so there's this article I do in class by a philosopher named Stace.
Yes.
You remember this one,
yes.
right? And he was saying...
He read it too.
Yeah, I read a couple of the ethical relativism
Perfect.
papers.
And he was comparing it to something like the shape of the Earth. But you could pick any example, right? Like, there are people still who believe the Earth is flat, right? There's a multitude of beliefs, you might say, with regard to the shape of the Earth. That doesn't mean the Earth doesn't have a real shape. That just means our understanding of it is skewed, and like some people are right and some people are wrong, right? The philosopher goes, exactly, right? It's just like that. It's just like that in ethics.
So how do you know whose opinion is the right one?
We're trying to figure it out. That's why we have this thing called truth, which we say, okay, when your claims correspond with reality, that's true. When it doesn't, it's false. And we try and make arguments about what's true and what's not true, right? We set up pieces of evidence that are intended to support other pieces of evidence, that are intended to support other pieces of evidence, that are intended to support some grand conclusion. And the only way we have of trying to figuring out what's right is rational argumentation. Because if we don't have that, to go back to something you said previously, that we're animals, right? That's kind of what separates us. So there's the logical issue with relativism, and then there's, of course, like another issue with relativism, which is if we take it seriously, then we can't condemn anything with any real vigor, with any legitimacy. Because the thing we're condemning could just be like, well, that's just my belief, and I'm just as valid as you, right? And if you think about this in the context of, like, crazy things, right, like child sacrifice, or like serial murders or rapists or people who abduct children or people who shoot up schools, it's like you want to be able to criticize those things and not just based on your feelings. It's like you think there's some objective basis for criticizing it. Maybe not objective in the sense of there being some free-floating good out in the external universe, but more like objective, relative, different kind of relative, to all human subjects as a whole rather than each individual subject or little factions of subjects, which is kind of more of what the relativist gets at.
Do you want to go into Kant?
Yeah, I think we should.
The anti-relativist.
Yeah. So he claimed that actions only done from duty have moral worth. Why does he reject acting merely from inclination or emotion as ethically sufficient?
Because he wants to avoid total subjective relativism. He thinks that we have a lot of problems in life, in ethics and philosophy, because we're not having like clear objective standards. We're not thinking about it hard enough. And so we need to figure that out, because that's how we get the right answer and that's how we live well or whatever. So Kant, like every other philosopher we've talked about, thinks that reason is something that separates humans from non-humans. And he's kind of like, well, what's the purpose of reason? What does reason do well? And a lot of people say happiness or virtue, right? Or something like that. That's what all the previous philosophers were talking about. And he was like, I don't think so. I think reason's actually really bad at being happy. Like, so many people are unhappy, yet everyone has reason as a capacity, right? So really, I think what reason does well is reason. So ethics should be a totally rational pursuit, which is for him why the question of what the good is becomes less about my character over time in the world and less about the results of my actions and more about whether my actions are correct in principle according to a priori reasoning and whether or not I take the proper, motivation towards those things.
I mean, to me, that kind of sounds like if in your head you're morally justifying doing something evil, but in your head it was morally justifiable, then it's okay to do.
That's a good question.
Because you did it rationally.
So he derives objective rules precisely to avoid that. Because the thing that you're saying is actually kind of like relativism. This idea that if I think it and I have a reason for it, it must be valid. Whereas Kant is like, no, it's not just like you want to do something and you think it's right and you can give reasons for it that makes it right. Like, there are objective principles that determine whether something's right. Like, so for example, he says, your action has to be universalizable in principle, right? It has to be able to be done by all rational subjects all the time without logical contradiction. He also says you cannot use someone purely as a means to your own end, but you have to value them as an end in themselves. And so like these two rules kind of box out in a good way a lot of maybe the worst things that you're thinking. And of course we could still criticize the method and we could talk about what's good and what's bad about it, but yeah, I think he was trying to avoid the exact thing you were talking about.
Yeah, that's interesting. The whole idea of categorical imperative. I mean, throughout history, I mean, to me, it sounds very much like the golden rule. Like, don't do what you wouldn't want other people doing to you. Is there a lot of difference between them? Because I feel like that idea has floated around throughout history.
Yeah. So okay, that's a good thing to bring up because it actually shows a difference between Aristotle and Kant. The golden rule: do unto others as you would want them to do unto you, Kant would reject. Not because he thinks it's bad, totally, but because when you say, as you would want other people to do to you, you were thinking of consequences. You're thinking of benefits. And so for Kant, the golden rule is flawed because like you shouldn't do the right thing just because you would want them to do that to you. You should do the right thing because it's the right thing. And maybe incidentally you benefit from that.
Right?
Exactly. Right? We have like a logical duty to this moral law, independent of how it affects me and independent of how, it results in the world. He has this line like in the groundwork, utility or fruitlessness doesn't add to or subtract from the worth of the goodwill acting in accordance with the moral law. Whereas Aristotle, I think, would be like, yeah, no, we need this reciprocal community thing. It is about your motivations, but it's also about the world, and it's also about moderation. So, yeah, I think he might reject that on one specific basis, although in general, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world. Yeah, I don't know. Is that kind of...
Yeah, no, that's helpful. That helped me different, because I remember when I first read it, to me it sounded pretty similar to that idea throughout history. So that was helpful to differentiate between the two.
Because the test is like, if everyone does this, it like contradicts the first like premise. So I mean, I understand what you mean by that.
Like maybe a concrete example helps. Like, so stealing.
Yeah.
Right. So in order to steal, private property needs to exist, because if there was no private property, theft wouldn't, like, logically couldn't be a thing, right? So if everyone is stealing, hypothetically, right, we do this hypothetically, if everyone is stealing from each other all the time, logically there cannot be private property. But if there's no private property, there can't be stealing, and so stealing is against the moral law. Not because by stealing I'm hurting you, or making myself sad or something, but because it literally is impossible according to pure reason. And that's where he comes from. So he's totally in contrast to empiricists, actually, someone who thinks that reason in itself can solve these problems. You can deduce things, to go back to your previous question.
What do you think about that?
I don't know. I mean, to me, it just, again, sounds like there's room for subjectivity, because people have tried to reason through things and come to logical deductions.
Like spitting, we use that example in class.
Oh yeah, you could spit on everyone and that's not a contradiction.
Yeah, so it just, I don't know, to me it's a little bit, there's a lot of wiggle room when you're leaving morality just solely up to reason.
But at the same time, I think it could provide explanations.
Definitely, yeah, and there's definitely a place for
truth.
it.
Yeah, it leaves room for error. I think he'd be right. I think he would say you're right. He thinks the issue is like not with the principles, but with our ability.
Yeah, it's a reason.
It's like having a bad scientist, right? Or a good scientist that comes to wrong conclusions. Like, we don't say there's something wrong with the method or the goal. There's something wrong with us, which maybe is still wrong. But that's, I think, what he would say.
All right. Well, do you want to move on to the closing
we can do
reflections?
the closing.
Okay. So, across all these traditions, from Socrates' questioning to Kant's rationalism, philosophy keeps returning to the same question: what makes a good life?
Oh, God.
Why do you think that question endured across so many centuries and has been debated over and over again with so many different opinions and point of views?
I think it's a testament to how embedded that is in the human experience. Like, when you see patterns repeat all throughout history, it's probably real. It's probably significant. It's probably not a mere construct. It's probably not an accident. And I think it comes down to that, because we all live this thing, right, called the human condition. And yes, we have different experiences and different kinds of experiences, but there are some similar things. And with those similar things come similarities with regard to, like, questions about values and how I should be in this short time here on this earth, right? And for this reason, it's almost like primordial, right? It's almost built into us. It grabs us. You don't choose really to think about the good life. It just happens to you, right? No one doesn't think about this. I mean, even if you don't philosophize about it, you still are mad when something bad happens to you, and you still wonder about what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and, like, how you should respond to people who you're in relationships with who act in certain ways, and vice versa. So I think because it's like a given of what it means to be a human, that's it. That's why, right? I mean, Aristotle has this famous line: one begins to philosophize because they're profoundly curious, right? They wonder, they look up and they wonder these things. And I think that's, we just have these natural tendencies.
So how can modern students keep that sense of wonder alive in an age of information and certainty?
Oh my God, that's a whole nother one, especially now with technology.
Right.
But I think it's hard because of the technological environment we live in. And it's also hard because of the way the schooling system is on, like, the level of, how would you say, structurally, let's say. I think structurally there are some issues with the schooling system. And then there's the issues of, like, who do you have teaching these people, and who do you have as being in power, as being the rulers in the school system and in colleges. So it's hard because of all of these things. It's also hard because, I mean, you want to eat chips all day, right? You don't want to like think about these things. And so we all have an incredibly difficult task, right, that we're faced with. And if you're asking me like, how do I try to do these things? I mean, I try to be as relatable as possible. I mean, I don't know, you can speak to this if this is the case. I try to be like, hey, this stuff is real. Like, this stuff affects you. And, like, haven't you thought about these things? And, like, I'm just a person just like you. And, like, we're wondering about this. And I think you have to really build trust with, from my perspective, students. But from your guys' perspective, like, everyone. Because if you don't have trust, then you can't take someone seriously. You can't engage in serious conversations. So I think it's, like, building trust, being open, being objective, and not trying to, not like ramming your views down someone's throat, which unfortunately is like a thing sometimes in colleges. I think these are the keys. And then there's little things like, you know, I'm a jerk. I'm like, you can't have tech in class, right? And I think this helps, and students have told me that this helps.
It does help. I like that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's like pedagogical studies, scientific studies that show that these things fracture our attention, and they interfere with the ability to retain information, and they distract other people. And so, you know, there's the practical things with like policies, and then there's also the general disposition things for me as a teacher, and like trying to build relationships with you guys, and even things out of like this, right? Like, this isn't a classroom, but I think we're doing a good thing. And I co-run this organization called the Public Philosophy Project, where we try to do the same things. And we had that podcast for the love of Sophia, and we do a lot of hikes. Did you come to any of the hikes?
No, but Quentin was telling me about them.
Yeah, I mean, we do these philosophical hikes where we get students together outside of class and talk about some topic and walk around in nature. Man, we do like charity events with community things, where we get people from just regular people who live in a place together to talk about weird stuff. And you would think, like, who would do this, right? Like, who would get together outside? But it's a lot of people. Like, we did this charity event, and like, people bought tickets to come talk about philosophy who didn't know us. And these walks, they started out having like 15 people, which is decent, but our most recent one had 40 people.
Wow.
Like, it had so many people where we were like, we have to start doing separate groups on the walks. So I think there's a thirst for it, precisely because what you're saying, because we recognize the significance of this, and we're not getting enough of it in our daily lives and in other, you know, aspects of school, I guess. So I don't know, let's just try to do it together.
Where would you recommend someone start if they wanted to start studying philosophy more seriously?
Like, formally?
Yeah.
So number one, I would say take a class if you can.
Yeah.
Because it's good to start reading about stuff, and
it's so much different reading it like with a professor and reading it on your own, I would say. At least from my perspective.
Reading it on your own is good. Like, because I think that's how I got into it even before I knew I was into it. Like, one positive thing about like the early internet is just that you can read about things, right? Like, have like the encyclopedia online and go into a rabbit hole of like ideas, and you're like, oh my god. So I think like go into rabbit holes of philosophical things informally, so you can kind of self-direct your education on that level and see what you're interested in. Think about stuff, but then take a class if you can. Join a club if you can. Start a reading group. Join a pre-existing reading group. I think something like that. But if you're like, what should you start with in terms of reading philosophy? I think the early Platonic dialogues are a good start. In part because they're easier to read than some of the dense essays that come later in history, and even not later in history, because it's like characters in a play, right? So maybe something like, my first one was the Euthyphro I mentioned, but I think the Apology's good. I think the Crito's good. I think the Republic's good.
My favorite is probably Crito.
Oh yeah, I mean because it's a question about civil disobedience and the good life, and if we should value other people's opinions, and if we should like democracy. Like, it has all the things. So that's and it's short too. So I think maybe that's a good answer for the first. If you're into values, if you're into heady stuff, that's a harder question. Like, where do we start on consciousness? We'll bracket that for now.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me.